Welcome, everybody. This is the Listen Up Show. We're thrilled to have a great guest on today, Michael. Michael, proper pronunciation of your last name, because it has never, ever come up in our conversation.
Let's go with Lenczner.
Brilliantly handsome, devilishly handsome individual. Very accomplished, too. We are going to be talking about how our data may be lying to us. I met Michael. He invited me to be part of one of the projects he was working on. I joined more for Michael than the project, to be honest, because he was so enthusiastic and there was good resonance and good energy. He's been doing this work for over at least a decade that I found in terms of video and other things on here. So he splits his time between being the CEO of Ajah. He'll tell you a little bit more about that in a second. And then he founded Il Sans Fil. Did I say that right? Il Sans Fil?
Il Sans Fil.
Il Sans Fil. Okay, a community wireless group operating on 1,000 public hotspots in the Montreal area. So you can tell us a little bit more about that, but let's take a quick look. This is powered by data. Share with us a little bit about this project, and then we'll go to Ajah, and then we'll dive into this lying, deceitful data that we don't like.
Sure. Powered by Data is a nonprofit initiative we created that exists on the Tides platform, now called Makeway. But it's an initiative to really intervene in the policy areas of data use in the nonprofit sector. And it's a lot about making data more accessible to nonprofits so that they don't have to go through that work of collecting primary data themselves quite as much as there's alternatives to that.
Okay, perfect. And we're gonna unpack that. The other, this is your CEO role with Ajah. Just tell us a little bit about the organization.
Wanted to work in data in the nonprofit sector, and that was my background. It was in like 2007, 2008, trying to figure out what to do next. I couldn't really identify funding to do that work as a nonprofit, to work in the area of data in the nonprofit sector. So started a company at that age and kind of took one foot out of the nonprofit sector and the private sector. And so started a company, and what we do is mainly enterprise data management work with nonprofits, sometimes larger nonprofits or funders or nonprofits that hold systems. So it's less working with the individual small shop, and it's more larger organizations figuring out how they can execute on some of the information management parts of their work.
Okay, great. You've written a number of things, and we're going to share that afterwards. Here's one: measuring impact, communicating success. Big data won't save us. So let's dive in. Can you explain what you mean by, because you use the phrase data infrastructure, and the project that we're on in Canada is meant to bring some visibility and even get more data. Can you tell us what you mean by the infrastructure and why this is more important? Because there's lots of data out there already.
Yeah, there's certainly a ton of information and data out there. So in the nonprofit sector, I'd say all the things we have to do with data are systems too. They all have to be very intentional, and we have to decide what to do with them and what infrastructure does that turns things into system ones. So when you go into the mall, you don't often decide whether to take the stairs or the escalator, because the escalator is just sitting there right in front of you. To some extent, when you set up systems so they automate, so they're the default option. And our default options with information management and learning in the nonprofit sector, they're not necessarily very intentional. They've evolved instead of being designed. And it's really hard to talk about infrastructure because it seems obvious to us that we have cars the way that we have roads the way that we have, that all the decisions that have been made, they just seem very, very natural. So, the idea of our Powered by Data nonprofit initiative is saying data environment is very similar to a policy environment. Policy environments are not natural. No one obviously created the policy environment the way it is. It's a series of human decisions. It's a human artifact. And nonprofits understand the importance of a policy environment, how it hinders you in doing your work or how it helps you in doing your work. Corporations understand the importance of policy environments, and they engage in those conversations really intentionally, proactively, and they have a reactive capacity. And we're saying people should do the same thing with your data environment.
So you're saying the data environment, all that means, the data that's collected, the data that's available, the way we interpret it, and Google, the way we use it, all of that, right? It just is what it is. You're saying it lacks the intention we need to really leverage it the way it should be.
Yeah, and we don't have a discussion about it as an artifact as opposed to as part of the environment. So
Okay,
if we
artifact.
treated
Can you
data-
just unpack the word artifact and how
if we
you're using
treated
it there?
policy, I think if we treated policy the same way we treat data, we would study it, but we wouldn't really seek to intervene in it, right? We'd be like, we're just being buffeted by policy impacts all the time, and these things happen to us. We're going to learn about what it's like to negotiate that. But no, we say, well, this is the result of very specific things, and we can intervene in policy. And that's how we, right now, the Ontario Nonprofit Network is gearing up for a election that's going to happen in Ontario. And we know in the nonprofit sector how those elections are going to affect us. And we have proactive stances on a lot of different policy issues. And the nonprofit network is supported by a series of organizations across Ontario. We could do the same thing with data environments, and we don't know it, and it's not intentional for us to choose that or not to choose that.
Okay, let's come back to that. We call this the data is lying to you. Can we unpack that? Just because you see a number doesn't mean you're seeing the truth. There's a number of factors that contribute. So why does it come up as not accurate sometimes?
I think there's a lot of different ways of talking about how your data is lying to you. I think we talk a lot about the social construction of data, and the data is presented as neutral. And instead it reveals to us the systems we've set up, again, more than it talks to us about the natural. It teaches us just as much about the system as it does teaches about the things within the system. I think people are wrestling with this idea that data isn't neutral. So I think that's one thing about data is lying to you. And then
before you go on, can you give us an example? How it's not neutral? Because 1 + 1 is 2.
Great example is in police data, looking at communities that are captured in that data. You're going to see a bunch of youth, and what that doesn't tell you is that that area is over policed in a certain area. So necessarily you're going to see more youth in a certain area that show up in this data, which doesn't describe the youth at all, which purely describes the policing and the policy response to that community.
Great example. So we're getting data back, but if we knew how to look at it, we would see what the real issue is. Where there's more police, there's more crime, right? Because you got to do something.
How the question's framed determines the answer in a lot of ways. And I think that's the moral of the story in a lot of ways. Is the way we look at things and the way we set up our systems kind of determines what you get back.
Right. Okay. So Dan Heath, in his book Upstream, he talks about phantom data or phantom metrics. And the idea was that they collected, there's a bunch of sidewalks, I think it was Boston, and they said, well, we can see what's going on, but we're confused as to why most of the work is happening in these areas. Why is most of our maintenance on flattening and whatever sidewalks happening in these areas? Apparently these areas are worse, right? The sidewalks in these areas are worse because we have to keep going over there and collect them. So they went into the other neighborhoods. No. The other neighborhoods were absolutely worse. And they said, why don't you call to get this done? And they responded, because nobody comes anyways, because this is a Black community. Okay, so the data was determining where the budget spend was, and it was going where people were calling, but they didn't realize the bias in the system for actually collecting the data was at play and blinding them to where the money actually should be going.
Yeah, it even happens with hate crimes, where up where I think, and again, I'm not speaking from a position of authority, so please double check this. I think you can get fluctuations in different reporting of hate crimes, not based on, or I've heard it said that that's tied more to awareness and again, trust of police or trust of these systems than it would be describing an absolute number.
So we kind of have a sense of data and lying. What do you do with companies to resolve this issue? Are there things, or nonprofits even, what do you do with organizations that help them understand the data when it comes to them? Because we've already established that there's not a formal or intentional infrastructure for collecting and dispersing the data. So we're left with whatever we can cobble together with Google.
Infrastructure, again, is the elevators, is the default systems that work to kind of transport and exchange things. And they, again, this norm setting role that they play, we don't have those infrastructures in the nonprofit sector, I'd say. And so instead we have to decide what to do all the time. And the decisions we make about what to do is, well, I have a need for data, I'm going to collect data. And so we set up these systems around our individual organizations instead of having shared infrastructure of common roads and railroads and dams and stuff that we all use collectively is the idea. Working with organizations to do this, whether they're for-profits or nonprofits, it's around social impact. And I'd say two things that we do with people. One, it's getting them to try to address the assumptions that are made, and you want to test your assumptions. You don't want to take your assumptions for granted. You want to include them in the set of questions you're asking instead of excluding them because your programs are based on those assumptions. So
you're going to have to. Can you just explain what that means?
Yeah.
Or give us an example.
So it's a matter of being really, really explicit and saying, well, learning and reading levels, so we know from all of our experience that learning, instruction affects reading levels. However, if that's what your program is based on, that mechanism is the exact thing you need to test. So on one hand, it's the organization that's based on a premise, that instruction has an impact on reading. On the other hand, the evaluation system has to be designed to absolutely not take that as an assumption.
How do you do that? My assumption is that helping people in a homeless shelter have access to work is a good approach, partially to break the cycle of poverty.
Mm-hmm.
Now I'm focused on all the metrics to show that we're actually doing that or we're not. Mm-hmm. Lead and lag indicators, key performance, all that kind of thing. You're telling me I actually have to need to test what I may consider my first principle, like this is the axiomatic belief that I'm starting with. You think data should challenge that too?
I think the data systems work better when one is aware of all the assumptions. Knowing what your assumptions are, because those are the hardest things to really tackle in an organization, because again, it's the premise of the organization, the premise of its founding or of your program is based on something working. And so to set up where you can actually have a counterfactual to that, where you have, if this were not the case, here is where I would see it, right? It's weird and it's a bit alien to do.
It is. That is a bit proving a negative.
Proving a negative, but also it's the work that epidemiologists do and statisticians do, and it's a lot of non-intuitive thinking.
That sounds like way beyond the capabilities, and maybe the competencies of nonprofits. So I want to come back to that, but before we do, Miss Lewis.
Hello. It wasn't necessarily a question, but more of a comment that yes, I can fully agree with the idea that the data are lying to you, right? You need to understand why was this, why did we conduct this study? Who conducted it? Who commissioned it? Who paid for it? Where did it get published? Like all of these things are very important when we look at and say, oh, this and this is true. Is it true, or is it true with these considerations?
I think it was the 60s or something, maybe the 50s or 60s, the petroleum industry commissioned a number of studies proving that lead poisoning wasn't happening and it was totally fine. And Congress went along with it until this undeniable study came out that they kept pushing down. It's all in the Cosmos series. I don't know if you watched that or not, but it's fascinating. It's a great example, I think, of, Michael, what you're saying. Not only can you misunderstand your data because you never checked your first principle or you never subjected it to any sort of analysis. But secondly, based on the bias and the subjective perspective of the individual, you can make it say whatever you want. And that's the thing that I'm curious about, even in our work, because practitioners will look at the data and they'll say, well, volunteering's here and giving's here. And this year we introduced these programs and it went down. So the programs are the problem. Let's switch it up again. We'll come up with a new logo and a new thing and we'll get the numbers back up. That's a horrible way to approach work and make decisions in this space.
Well, just the number of assumptions is based on this. I think we dumb it down a bit too much, or I'm still learning about this. This is still like an area that fascinates me. But the idea that each nonprofit by itself is going to become an expert in measuring impact in an area, as well as being able to, design those projects, it's a bit of a weird story when you stop and think about it. Right?
Yep.
That we're going to be these statisticians and research designers, and all for a low price of, you give us $30,000 and then you get this evaluation out of it. So that's again why it's good to like double check assumptions. You're like, how should this work? And then also, how does this work in other sectors? And I think that's a really good reality check of saying, how do other people solve these problems? And what do I not know about statistically significant study design and sample sizes And then you have these volunteer boards that have no focus on research design necessarily, that are again all being encouraged to be experts in this type of area of research, but it's a lot. It's a
Okay,
lot.
so I want to come back to that. We're going to go to Ilya for a second, but you've just noted that, and I contributed to it, that on the business side, there's probably a low level of understanding around data collection and data interpretation, and making decisions based on that data. There's some good third-party groups out there that can help you with it, but in and of itself, I would say 8 out of 10 people have never heard of a logic model or a theory of change, for example. Then you go to the nonprofit where they know this, but who's got time to measure every single program to prove to somebody who gave me 30 grand, which was not even enough to run the program. Now I've got to do a data analysis, which, the big four would charge hundreds of thousands of dollars to do, but all the nonprofits should be able to do this for the low price of a small grant. And then in all of that, there's this whole aspect of bias where we're not really checking some of our assumptions, and we're not sure if we how to do that, and who has the time to do all of this anyways. And so there's all of that, and I want to pick it up there, but can we pause for a second and go over to Ilya?
I have a couple comments, right? I mean, the first comment is, around the research is that most of the research is designed to be fairly short. It's short term. You're trying to look at long-term results, long-term impact, things that would require, proper longitudinal studies and things like that. But you're saying, here's funding for a year. Show me how your approach has impacted, this particular issue. And that's like, you have to determine the quality of that research, right? So is it going to be kind of like a marketing white paper versus something that stands up, academically, right? And I think the funding associated with that has to match. But the comment I'm saying is that, it's really to Michael's point earlier, where, when I work with primarily people analytics, workforce analytics, workforce data, and things like that, we observe a lot of stuff, right? So we look at descriptive data. How do we do this quarter, last quarter, this year, last 5 years, whatever. And we keep observing the same information. Like, we're watching this tree grow, but we're not actually watering it. We're not giving it fertilizer. We're not doing anything to it. We're just kind of like, we're just observing the thing and hoping that it will change somehow because we've observed it, right? And determining what's good and what's bad by looking elsewhere and saying, well, how does your watched tree grow versus fertilized tree grows or whatever, right? So it becomes a little bit of an exercise of what are we actually looking for in the data? Are we looking to have it? Are we looking to observe it, or are we actually looking to impact something about that drives the impacts of that data? I think it's a question of maturity to some extent, right? Maturity and capability and comfort with data.
I was with you until you said we get there through maturity. I don't think epidemiologists evolved these lessons. Like, I don't know if we should be taking one step in front of the other as an approach to these problems, as opposed to saying, what does research design look like, and how actually as a sector are we going to get there, and how have other sectors reformed or improved their measurement and their accountability measures? Because we could say that about the police. The police are going to get there through data maturity. They're going to figure out how to learn, but they might not. And I don't think anyone would say necessarily that would be the right thing to wait for them to do that. And so, not that there's a parallel between the police and the nonprofit sector, but to say as a field, maturity isn't necessarily the right metaphor to think about, and how evolution isn't necessarily the right metaphor to think about it, because that invites us to think about each nonprofit having a lab where you have effectively PhD capabilities within that organization. And I don't think that's realistic. I don't think that's a good idea. I don't think it's a realizable idea.
What do you mean by learning then, as opposed to, because that feels like a term that I could change in for evolution or maturity. I'm learning, I'm developing, but I think you're thinking something quite different.
Yeah,
than a natural sort of figuring it out as we go. You're saying there's not going to be a natural figure it out as we go.
Something people say in computers is you have you optimize, but you're optimizing in a dead end system, right? You're optimizing an area of you hit rate. We hit the number 4,022, and that's the highest we've ever hit. And then we're optimizing to get that number up higher, but you're only optimizing in that local system. So you're missing the optimizations that will get you up to 8,000, right? They're recasting how you're approaching yourself, how you're approaching your problem. So when I think about learning the nonprofit sector, we could iterate, and we could have an evolutionary kind of approach to what we're doing, Or we could have a more of a radical question, say like, how does learning actually take place? Let's look at how it works in our sector versus other sectors. And in the nonprofit sector, again, our learning is mainly through things like conferences. It's weird that we don't have other mechanisms and infrastructures to allow for learning. Imagine academia where academia doesn't have journals. And what does that look like? Right? If you have criminology, if you have environmental change, but journals don't exist and people have to meet together in person once a year to exchange information, that would be laughable.
So I invent insulin. I'm one of the Canadians that invents insulin, and I use it and I share it. And I only measure some rudimentary stuff. How many people I stick that it worked? How many people I stick that it didn't? And we just go crazy, right? That would never happen in the medical field. There's all these tests, and there's a methodology, as an approach to demonstrate this is a viable, workable option, versus what we do with nonprofit, which is much more, we stick it in some people, we don't in others, and then we say, oh, that seems to be a good approach. We're using the more of the, let's see what happens, versus the medical profession, which has a systematized approach to prove that this is the
and
right
we
way
didn't
to go.
used to we didn't used to invest in medicine have that. Pharmaceutical companies used to be able to do trials on humans and not share the results. And then in the 80s or at some point, the FDA and Europe and in Canada we have the same thing. They said if you're going to experiment on humans, it's your moral obligation to share the results. And so your clinical trial needs to be registered. So you're registered what your trial is, that everyone else knows that you're doing this trial. So we don't have to find 10,000 humans to experiment on because you're already doing it. And we know that we're going to get access to the data afterwards. The level of positive results, of positive impact of all the different trials dropped dramatically, right? When people were forced to publish all of the results, they didn't cherry pick only the good results that they share. And suddenly the results went from 80% success rate of look at our new drugs, they all work, to 20% success rates of most of our drugs don't work.
Wow. Okay. So bring that over to the nonprofit sector. Now there's a carrot stick thing there. And let's say if you're measuring impact, let's stick with homelessness, around interventions around homelessness, you have to report against these standards that we as a nonprofit sector have come up with. And then we all get to see it. And then you'll see our reporting compared to your reporting. And then we can see, based on 1,000 organizations working with 1 million homeless people in Canada, we can actually see what works. Is that more of what you're suggesting?
I think that's a bit utopian as well, that the system's going to work well. Instead, I believe in building systems for things that don't work well so that they end up working well.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
So
okay. You're going to have to explain what that means too.
With the clinical drug system, you assume that maybe people can't agree on exactly how to measure stuff because they're different pharmaceutical companies. So you say, you know what, you publish whatever you publish, but it has to conform generally to these things. But suddenly you're getting stuff from them that you never gotten from them on these clinical trials. You're exposing, the financial interests of other pharmaceutical companies. They're going to be tearing through this information, looking through it, trying to find stuff. So it's not a perfect system that works well if everyone does the right thing. It works even if people just do it badly and broadly, kind of thing. It's very important not to blame nonprofits or blame even funders for this kind of situation. There's people are working, doing crazy, working as hard as they can in very difficult situations, difficult systems. But if the incentives are set up in such a way that you had to publish public evaluations of your project, even if those evaluations were of different levels of quality, there would still be a chance for learning. And if those evaluations were available the same way the journal articles are available, where there's some basic kind of metadata or just a write-up and we knew where to find them, then there would be an opportunity to say, okay, I know who else in my city is working on these things, and I'm now getting a look behind the curtains of what even their ideas are and how they're testing them, and kind of some broad swaths of what the results are.
So the data doesn't necessarily provide insight as to just merely effectiveness, but it should actually be informing, you say learning, we should actually be learning about homelessness. We should be learning about the broad interventions. We should be learning about data collection methodology and what's working, what's not, what you're producing results, and is that kind of what the learning phrase means?
if you look, yeah, if I think we need to organize our learning for learning about systems. So if you look again at cancer, about how we learn about cancer or climate change or anything else, we have large collaborative projects where we are
Yeah.
pooling data and pooling resources and tackling questions. And then you take a step over to the nonprofit sector. Sometimes it's a very fine line from health to mental health, or from a certain environmental area to education and environment. And suddenly the information treatment practices change drastically. And what we think of individual organizations are going to learn things on their own and then champion that somehow through knowledge translation. And it doesn't make sense to organize your learning through a series of individual service provider organizations that are not even, their goal is not learning in the first place. It's just very arbitrary. But then again, you look at any other sector and you're like, that's not how we do not look at learning as a Sisyphusian ordeal undertaken by individuals or small groups of heroes, right? We set up systems that produce learning.
Jerome, would you mind coming off mute and just articulating your comment, question, observation?
Yeah. So my point, and I work for Marriott International, and one of the things that we're looking at now more intently is ESG reporting criteria and disclosures, because of course, public companies are now getting scrutinized by the SEC, and there's a lot more rigor that's involved with how we're reporting these disclosures. And what you're suggesting, Michael, is almost like greater rigor around the accountability mechanisms of reporting and disclosures for the nonprofit sector, that as a result of that, or in part as a result, would create those mechanisms for learning, or those systems that would then almost prompt people to learn and become better at this type of work. As I'm sort of thinking about the journey that our company has taken in human rights, we've been focused on human trafficking more specifically over the last, the greater part of 10 years now. But what I see is that incrementally, we're being nudged in a direction where we are thinking about these things more critically. And it's not just about instituting human trafficking awareness training and being able to capture the amount of associates that have taken a training or different versions of the training, but now it's also reporting that, and then also reporting like what we're not doing so well in the human trafficking space, and saying, well, it's great that we have X number or X% of associates who are taking the training and awareness, but oh, by the way, we're also reporting every single incident where we've had a human trafficking or human rights infringement. And then thinking about that as yes, and start thinking about these things as even broader than human trafficking, and start thinking about land rights. And it's required us to become more advanced in how we understand our place in addressing that issue.
I've seen great examples of learning and insight, but what I wonder is, do the information sharing practices change to correspond with this understanding of the systemic layer of the work and the intricacy and interdependencies of the work, if we're still just taking our learnings and going to conferences, or if we still conceive of the learning being within the walls of our organization, or as this dyad of only between us and our grantees. And it seems like we need to adjust our learning to accompany our changing understanding of these problems.
I do want to touch on one other thing. We've kind of touched on it a little bit. When we think about online, because it's taking us to the nonprofit sector, and we're talking about giving and volunteering, and there's exchange of resources and value. When we think about this learning and kind of elevating the sector by moving just away from this, I'll give the information to my grantee, my grantor. I'll collect the data. They want me to be an expert in impact or whatever. I'll give it to them. We'll be done. I'll get a grant next year. That's it. You're saying, or there might be a conference where I talk about it. Maybe you're saying there should be, like in the medical field, there's journals, there's public information, there's standards, there's protocol around what is an acceptable way to test things and not. There's just basic understandings of how science works. And you're saying this sector needs that, rather than thank you for the money. Here's what we did. Hey, can I tell everybody what we did? And that would be it.
That plus we need to go over, look at science and see how even with all that infrastructure, they're currently still failing in really surprising ways. There's something called the replication crisis that's happening in behavioral science, in psychology, in nutrition sciences, where because people are not sharing the data of their studies, bad behavior is being rewarded. And you have very, very, well-known professors that are having their studies retracted because they falsified the data or engaged in p-hacking, or just, the idea of the torture the data until it confesses. And that's
but with the infrastructure, you can see that, right? Like without it, you're sort of left with, I don't know.
Absolutely.
They
Well, they figured out things like, turns out the numbers are not random, right? Where if you use numbers in a report and you make them up, you actually come up with different numbers than if you do based on real world data. So things like that you would never look for in the first 40 years of kind of setting up these systems emerge as you pay more attention to them.
Okay, let's switch over to transparency, privacy. In Canada, there's a bunch of trucks in Ottawa. I hear they're taking on another city. $8 million in GoFundMe. The Canadian authorities said, hey, we're a little concerned about where that money's coming from. Some of it looks dark, like it might be from foreign entities just trying to screw with Canada. And so GoFundMe decided to do something about it. And Michael, maybe you can unpack that because I'm not sure exactly what that process was. But then they just shifted over to the Christian platform, which allows you to give to the Klan or Nazis, or they don't care. There's no moral compass on the Christian one, ironic. You can give to whoever you want, however you want. What is the balance from your perspective when we think about infrastructure and reporting? What's the balance between privacy of my personal data, who I want to give to and what I want to do, which the Christian platform exemplifies, and transparency, and which could show that a foreign entity was trying to hit Canada's economy through this event?
From what I understand, GoFundMe said that they weren't going to continue giving away the money, but instead they were going to allow people to ask for it back, or they were going to distribute it to a second charity, to other charitable causes.
So what's the balance? And now with Bitcoin giving is significant, but the value that could be tapped into is enormous. And some platforms are starting to take Bitcoin. So do you have any thoughts about, we should be able to see, but it's private? How does that work?
So I think it's a really tricky question because in some way, you pick an example of wanting to support working against homophobia in Uganda. And then does the government have a right to know what investments are being made in this country? And how do you address that? Like, how do you tackle that? But I think we'd have an answer that is a North American answer to that question, that is, we do that work and that is normal. And that is something that we consider a good thing, and charity is working abroad. And that involves that contains our values in it, and that's something we're comfortable with. There is something called IATI, the International Aid Transparency Initiative, started kind of by the UK, and that's the example of this infrastructure, Chris, that we don't have in the domestic nonprofit sector.
That brings it right around. Yeah.
Where in the international sector, they've said we're going to actually put down in one place all of the grants we give out every year, and there's going to be a description of them. And there's many reasons for that. It's not just accountability. It's also that so the recipient countries actually know when they're going to get the money that was promised to them at some big international conference. And said, oh, we're going to give $800 million or $80 million to Burkina Faso. Burkina Faso is like, when is it going to, like, I'm the Minister of Education. I need to know when I'm going to get that money and what strings you're tying to it. So IATI is a way of publishing all that information. And it seems clear IATI is partially also a response to increased international aid from China, but that is not at all transparent, right? And you can imagine the difficulties that China would have in making its aid transparent and giving those contracts out, as opposed to a Western country that type of transparency is built into our governance systems. So again, there's this jostling and there's this values.
My final observation and why this was interesting to me is that without this infrastructure to help guide understanding information, data that's coming in, even including who gave what, where, and why, and when, it's national security. And these days, that could be at stake. And I think the Canadian truck driver episode is a great example of how this isn't just having more accurate information about how many homeless people we help. It is a big issue that would touch on a lot of things, not the least of which could be national security. But that's a whole big topic that we don't have time to go on. Next month, on the second Wednesday, we're going to talk about trust-based philanthropy. We're going to address the power differential in the nonprofit and the donor or the donating organization, from which comes this demand for impact data that the nonprofit is like, whatever, sure, I'll give it to you. And honestly, Michael, thank you so much. I love it when people come on the show and I think, I have got to go away and think about what we just talked about a little bit more. I need some time to process. And I just love that.
I'm interested if it sparks anything in your brain. So happy to chat.
Awesome.
And thank you very much, Chris.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.